At the temple, a painting of the gods hangs on the wall beside a large statue. A man in a baseball uniform quietly stares at them, and somehow, he looks hopeful. This right here is the main protagonist of our story. Someone calls out, "Dan," making him turn around. It's the monk. The monk asks if he's heading to the game. Dan nods and says yes. Today is the finals. The monk smirks and teases him. If he loses, he should just shave his head and become a monk. Dan honestly can't tell if the monk is cheering for him or preparing to recruit him. Suddenly, someone rushes in and calls out, "Big brother!" A teenage girl appears, half awake, brushing her teeth while walking. She squints at him and asks if he's leaving already. Dan looks confused and asks why she's even awake this early. She tells him to hold out his hand, then she drops a small keychain into his palm. Dan stares at it, completely puzzled. She gets annoyed and explains that it's obviously a cute doll. It's a tiny blue bear with white horns, thick eyebrows, and sharp little fangs. Dan isn't sure cute is the right word, which only makes her more annoyed. She quickly apologizes, saying she's not very good with her hands. She tells him to just treat it like a lucky charm or something. Dan asks if she made it herself, and the question immediately makes her shy. He thanks her and promises he'll take good care of it. Then he rubs her head and teases her for suddenly doing such thoughtful things. She instantly fires back that she hasn't even washed her hair yet. Dan jumps back and screams that his hand is going to rot. He even asks the monk to purify it. She kicks him and tells him to just go already. Their little argument is honestly hilarious. But then the monk calls Dan's name again. Both of them stop. The monk quietly tells Dan to come back safe today as well. Dan simply smiles and assures him not to worry. He promises he'll come back after winning in style. The monk believes him. After all, Dan will come back victorious. At the stadium, the announcer's voice boomed across the field. Bottom of the ninth, 2 outs, bases loaded. The score was tied. Whoever won this game would take the high school baseball championship. Everyone held their breath, wondering if Guangdong High could survive this crisis. Stepping up to the plate was player Kim Dan. He tightened his grip on the bat. The announcer reminded the crowd that Kim Dan was something special. People were already calling him the best baseball prospect in all of Korea. The pitcher began his motion. The tension between the players was thick enough to cut with a knife. The first pitch flew out of the pitcher's hand. The ball shot forward at blazing speed. Dan readied his swing, and he struck. The bat connected cleanly. The ball blasted past the pitcher. It all happened in a blink. The ball soared higher and higher. A glove reached up and caught it, but it wasn't a player, it was someone in the audience. The stadium exploded with cheers. Home run! Kim Dan had done it. The announcer shouted that Dan was truly an incredible player. Watching him almost reminded the announcer of his own playing days in the United States. And with that final hit, Sangdan High defeated Guangdong High to claim the championship. They even prepared an exclusive interview with their star player. That night. After winning the high school tournament, Dan knew one thing for sure. His chances in the upcoming draft had just skyrocketed. Still, he had one small regret. He forgot to buy rice cakes on the way back. Then again, the monk was already old. Were rice cakes even okay for him to eat? But honestly, since Dan was the one who won the championship, shouldn't they be the ones buying him fried chicken? Suddenly, smack. He got hit on the back of the head. It was his sister. She complained that he was walking slower than a snail. Then she asked what he was thinking about so seriously. Unfortunately for Dan, his peaceful victory walk had just turned into sibling interrogation. He was shocked. He told her to put her head out. She stuck her tongue out and threatened to tell the monk if he hit her. So he switched tactics and teased her instead, asking if she even washed her hair. She immediately screamed that she did. They kept walking together. She told him their school aired the baseball game during class. And when he hit the home run, every classroom screamed so loud, the school started getting complaints. Dan puffed up proudly and said that was only natural. After all, an unparalleled genius had just appeared in Korea. She rolled her eyes and said it was all thanks to the lucky charm she gave him. Dan replied with a very sarcastic, yes. She immediately said that meant he should buy her something next time. Dan told her he was already starving, so they better hurry home and eat. And since he was the one who won the game, he expected her to do the dishes tonight. She complained that doing the dishes had absolutely nothing to do with baseball. When they reached the temple, Dan pushed the door open and loudly announced that he was back. But through the small opening, he saw something strange. The monk was lying on the ground, and standing in front of him was a man wearing a red cape. Dan leaned closer, trying to see more clearly. At the same time, his sister froze. She pushed the door open wider and asked why he wasn't going inside. Then she saw it too. Her face turned pale as she screamed the monk's name. Dan's heart dropped. The man calmly said that it had nothing to do with him. But Dan didn't believe a single word. He rushed forward and swung his bat at the man, but the man easily dodged the attack. Then he slowly turned his gaze toward Dan. Dan shouted at Kim Yena to run. She hesitated, clearly worried about him, but he yelled again, telling her to hurry. Tears rolled down her face. Then she finally ran. Dan's mind raced. Who was this man, and why was he here at the temple? Most importantly, what happened to the monk? He prayed the old man wasn't dead yet. Right now, there was only one thing he needed to do: subdue the man first. At least he was lucky about one thing. The intruder didn't seem to be carrying any weapon. The man spoke calmly, saying he would like to explain everything, but unfortunately, he didn't have much time left. He apologized that things had come to this. Then he pulled out a crystal. It suddenly began to glow with a bright light. Dan's eyes widened in alarm. In a blink, the man vanished. The next moment, he had already closed the distance and struck Dan. Before Dan could react, the man pressed the glowing crystal onto his chest. Then, he called Dan by name. He told him to find Eniar. Dan froze, because when he looked closely, the man's face was exactly the same as his. Then suddenly, it felt like the ground shattered beneath him. And Dan began falling. He was completely confused. The ground was collapsing, and his body kept dropping into darkness. He tried to speak, but no words came out. His consciousness slowly began to fade, but he desperately fought against it. Yena and the monk were still behind him. He couldn't just pass out now. When he opened his eyes again, the sight in front of him made his blood run cold. A skull sat on the ground, and inside the skull, a centipede wriggled around. Dan screamed. The creepy skeleton made his skin crawl. Why would something like this even be here? More importantly, where exactly was he? It looked like he had fallen into some kind of strange cave. His hand brushed against something nearby. When he looked down, his heart nearly stopped. It was an egg, and inside the egg, a centipede was writhing. Dan felt a wave of horror wash over him. Then he looked around. Eggs! They were everywhere. Suddenly, crack! One of the eggs split open. A limb slowly pushed out from the shell. Then the rest of the creature crawled free. It had multiple legs and a mouth full of sharp teeth. The spider began crawling straight toward him, and all around him, the other eggs started hatching too. Dan stood frozen in terror. He had no idea what was happening anymore. The creature suddenly lunged and sank its fangs into his shoulder. Venom rushed through his veins. Dan screamed and shook the spider off. He groaned in pain as his arm burned like it was on fire. What the hell were these bugs? More of them started crawling toward him. Thankfully, his bat had fallen down with him. He quickly grabbed it and swung it at the bugs to keep them away. But he knew he couldn't fight that many at once. He needed to get out of there first. Dan ran as fast as he could while the bugs chased after him. He kept running even though he had no idea where he was. First, he had to find somewhere to hide. The bugs were fast, way too fast. Then it hit him. He was inside a massive cave. His eyes widened as the bugs closed in. He had no choice. Dan jumped into the lake and splashed into the water. His head popped above the surface. He felt relieved when the bugs stopped at the edge. They couldn't enter the water. But then, a sharp pain shot through his leg. Some wriggling bugs had latched onto him. Dan quickly rushed to the shore and tore them off his legs. They were leeches. He sighed in frustration. Monsters were literally everywhere. And now he seriously wondered where the hell he had ended up. Dan had spent his whole life playing baseball, but he had never seen or even heard of anything like this. It made him wonder if he was even in the same world anymore. His hand suddenly touched something soft. To his surprise, it was the charm his sister gave him. It was worn out now, missing its right eye and one horn. He frowned, wondering how it ended up there. Maybe it had been in his pocket the whole time. Then he thought about Yena. He also wondered if the monk was safe, and of course, he remembered that punk who dared to mess with them. But Dan forced himself to stop those thoughts. Panicking wouldn't fix anything. He took a deep breath and tried to pull himself together. Right now, the best thing he could do was act. There had to be a way out. Now that he had calmed down a bit, he decided to check his surroundings. Little did he know, a creature was already behind him. Its poisonous saliva dripped on his bat, and that's when he noticed it. A massive spider monster was right there. Dan froze. The spider suddenly attacked, forcing him to drop to the ground to dodge. He quickly rolled and turned around, just in time to see what was chasing him. He knew one thing for sure. He had to run. Luckily, he noticed something crucial right away. He spotted a narrow crack in the cave wall. Dan rushed toward it. He was almost there. The small opening was right in front of him, but the spider's leg was only inches away. He almost got bitten. Luckily, he managed to squeeze inside. And the spider was too big to follow, but he relaxed too soon. The creature shoved one of its legs inside the crack, stabbing it down between his feet. It tried to drag him out. Thankfully, it couldn't reach him. Dan trembled as he stared at the monster's mouth, filled with rows of sharp teeth. After a moment, the spider finally pulled back and crawled away. Dan let out a shaky breath. For a second there, he really thought he was going to die. Then he noticed something strange. His arm had turned purple, and his veins were bulging under the skin. It must have been the venom from the bug earlier. Worse, he couldn't even feel his arm anymore, as if things weren't bad enough already. His life was hanging by a thread, and now his arm was basically useless too. Still, he couldn't hide there forever. Dan slowly peeked outside the crack. He scanned the cave, trying to figure out what to do next. Then he noticed something, a faint light, and standing in front of it, the shadow of a person. Dan immediately called out to them. He shouted that he was over here. Relief flooded his chest. He thought he had been completely alone down here. But when the person stepped closer, Dan finally saw their face. And what he saw made his blood run cold. Dan saw that it was a skeleton with a spider on its head. He froze when he realized it wasn't a person at all, but another monster. It then tried to bite him. Luckily, he was able to dodge. When the skeleton fell face down, he finally saw the spider clearly. Its tail-like limb was stabbed straight into the skull, like a parasite controlling the body. He tightened his grip on his bat. Whatever that thing was, if he smashed it, it should die. But he was shocked. His bat snapped in half instead. The angry bug turned toward him. The skeleton lunged forward and bit Dan's shoulder. He groaned in pain. He tried to shove it away. He jammed the broken bat handle into its mouth and pushed it back. It shook the bat off and rushed toward him again. He froze in horror when it grabbed his face. It tried to bite his head off, but he blocked it with his arm. It bit his arm instead. He groaned from the pain. His other hand searched the ground for anything. He managed to grab a stone, and he smashed the skeleton with it. The skeleton collapsed to the ground. Then he lunged forward to finish it. He kept smashing it with the stone. The cracking sound echoed through the cave. The skull with the parasite shattered, and it left him completely exhausted. But the moment he finished, more monsters appeared. At this point, he already looked fed up. Different monsters crawled out of the darkness. All of the undead had parasites stuck on their skulls. Now, his anger made him want to see this through to the end. He started running. He charged forward at the same time the monsters rushed him. Dan punched the monsters. A dog skeleton monster bit his calf. He gritted his teeth from the pain. He fought back by smashing his elbow into the skeleton. But there was more. An undead humanoid jumped at him. It slammed him to the ground and tried to bite his face off. Thankfully, he managed to shove it away before the others reached him. Out of nowhere, he heard someone say that it was amusing. His eyes widened. He glanced toward the voice and saw that it was his lucky charm speaking. He stared at the little doll in disbelief. He couldn't believe it was talking. For a moment, he wondered if he had finally lost his mind. He asked what it was. The doll turned misty. It calmly said that it didn't matter. Dan was about to die, so if he grabbed it, he would live. He asked what it meant. Right at that moment, it was as if time slowed down. The voice urged him to hurry because the monsters were closing in. He ran as fast as he could toward the blue flame, while the monsters chased right behind him. He was almost there. One monster almost grabbed him, but his hand touched the misty doll first, and a bright light burst out. Because of that light, the monsters couldn't come close to him. He found himself holding the mist in his hand. His eyes burned with blue flames. At first, he didn't understand the weapon forming in his hand, but it slowly took shape as a baseball bat. He felt a little disappointed. Of all things, it was just a baseball bat. The monster screeched loudly and rushed at him. Dan's anger finally exploded. He swung the bat with everything he had. The monster's body exploded apart from the impact. He blinked in shock at what just happened. Only the monster's legs were left on the ground. He could feel power surging through his body. Maybe it was because of the bat. He had no idea what was happening, but with it, he felt like he could fight back. Where he was, or what the bat really was, or why he had to go through all of this. None of it mattered anymore. Because now, he would crush every single one of them and survive. The corpses of the monsters were scattered everywhere, and most of them were torn apart. At that point, Dan was already breathing heavily. He couldn't believe what had just happened. His club was extraordinary. He could feel power flowing through his entire body. He wondered if it was some kind of magic, but then the club suddenly turned into mist. He stared at it in shock. The mist gathered and formed into some kind of strange creature. It honestly scared him. Then it turned toward the monster corpses. Dan had no idea what he was looking at. The creature started devouring the monsters. It floated around, consuming every single corpse, and when it finished, it began to glow brightly. Then it returned to Dan's hands. It had turned back into a baseball bat again. Suddenly, his heart tightened. Our boy experienced the most excruciating pain he ever felt in his entire life. He crouched down from it. He had no idea why this sudden pain hit him. Then, he noticed something strange happening to his body. The wound on his arm was gone, and it wasn't just his arm. Even the small scratches had disappeared. Everything had healed instantly. And he felt stronger somehow. He wondered if it was the power of the club. He thought it was incredible. With this thing, he might actually survive. But his stomach growled loudly. He was starving. Then he noticed some glowing mushrooms nearby. He stared at them and thought about it for a long moment. Right now, the mushrooms were the only thing he could eat, but monsters were dangerous. Those mushrooms might be poisonous. Still, he made his decision. He was going to eat them. He'd rather risk poison than slowly starve to death. Dan took a bite, and his eyes widened in surprise. They were actually delicious. The gamble paid off big time. Having regained his strength, in truth, it wouldn't have been surprising if he had gotten sick at any moment. He was glad that food was taken care of for now. After that, he went to the pool of water. There were leeches in it, but at least it was drinkable. Still, it felt disgusting. In truth, it wouldn't have been surprising if he had gotten sick at any moment, but perhaps because of the club's influence, he stayed mostly unharmed. Even the brutal survival in the cave became somewhat manageable thanks to that mysterious power. Just as he's beginning to adjust to life in the cave, the monsters that kept swarming him reminded him that this wasn't the world he once lived in. Those insects, which seemed to parasitize the corpses of other creatures, had hard shells, but their weak spots were easy to hit. Taking them down wasn't that difficult, though that was entirely thanks to the club. Once he killed the monsters, the club would devour the remains, and when it returned to him, his body would heal and grow even stronger. In that way, he slowly adapted to this hellhole, little by little regaining hope and the confidence that he could survive. That is, until he encountered someone. Countless dangers lurked in this dark place, but the most dangerous of all was definitely that huge monster. Fortunately, it only wandered near the nest from time to time. It didn't seem to be making any other moves. He wandered the cave for a long time while avoiding it, but he couldn't find any exit. In the end, he reached one conclusion. The exit had to be on the opposite side of the nest where he first started. The problem was that he would have to pass through that hellhole, even if he could deal with the insects and smaller monsters. He wondered if he could get past that huge monster. On top of that, he wondered if he would ever be able to return to where his family was. The thought of being trapped in that hell forever made his mood sink. He also wondered how he had even fallen into this place, and why the man in the robe earlier looked exactly like him. He remembered the man telling him to find something. He wrestled with those painful thoughts. But after a while, he stopped. Thinking about it wouldn't help him survive. So he decided to focus on getting out of there. He kept walking through the cave, until he reached the place where everything had started. The bugs were still crawling out of the eggs. He looked around carefully and realized that the giant monster wasn't there. Only the small fries, and they didn't seem particularly agitated either. That made him believe he could pull it off. He stepped on a bone, and it made a loud crack. It made him freeze. He slowly turned his head. He sighed in relief when nothing appeared. He guessed the monster simply didn't hear him. He was shaking like a leaf, but he still managed to reach the other side safely. Dan kept moving, hoping he could leave all of this behind soon, because he was getting out of here. He eventually reached a part of the cave where the ceiling had a large opening and light poured through. Eggs were scattered in the area, too. He couldn't see any clear path outside, which made him wonder if it was a dead end. But the light looked like it came from outside. He thought about climbing up there, but then he stepped on something. And it startled him. It made a loud sound, so he slowly glanced down. Unfortunately, he was standing right on top of the huge monster's body, and he had just caught its attention. The huge monster attacked him and slammed him to the ground. The impact made him cough blood. It hurt. A lot. He cursed in his head. Then he realized something. This was the huge monster's nest. The creature rushed forward, ready to eat him. Dan felt horror crawl up his spine as he struggled to stand. He quickly raised his bat. He swung with everything he had so the monster couldn't reach him. The bat struck the monster's limb. Green blood splashed out. For a moment, Dan got a little cocky. This fight felt different from their first encounter. The huge monster clearly didn't like that. It charged at him again. But Dan could read its movements. He had always trusted his kinetic vision. Still, this monster was on another level. He blocked its attacking limbs. The huge monster let out a loud screech. Dan kept watching it carefully. When he saw the wound on its limb, he felt relieved. His attack had worked. Now he knew something important. He could win. The monster suddenly opened its mouth. Then it released a terrifying roar. Dan's face turned pale. The ground started trembling. Small, spider-like bugs rushed toward them. There were so many that they almost looked like one giant creature. Dan could only think one thing. This was completely unfair. He tightened his grip on his sword, then he smashed the spider-like bugs away. He glanced behind him and struck more bugs that tried to sneak up from the back. One of the bugs flipped onto its back. By now, Dan was breathing hard. Bug corpses were scattered all around him, but more small bugs kept crawling out beside the huge monster. It looked endless. Something suddenly moved fast. Dan's eyes widened. In the next instant, the monster's limb pierced straight through his chest. He gritted his teeth and endured the pain. He struggled to pull himself free. A painful groan escaped his mouth, but he still gripped his bat tightly. Then he smashed the limb with all his strength, trying to break free. It tore the limb, making the monster screech loudly. Finally, the limb lodged in his chest was pulled out, but Dan was bleeding heavily. His complexion looked terrible, and there were still so many monsters in front of him. His vision started to blur. He wondered if it was because he had lost too much blood. He started to feel dizzy. He wondered if this was as far as he could go. He didn't think he could win like this at all. He knew there was nothing more he could do. He wondered what he was even supposed to do now. Suddenly, he heard someone tell him to fight. When he looked up, he saw Yaina. She told him not to even think about giving up there. He was about to ask her questions, but she cut him off and told him to get up. She said that she and the monk were waiting for him. She urged him to hurry, stand up, and fight. That snapped him back to his senses. He turned around and reached for his baseball bat. He moved quickly as the small bugs jumped at him. The creature inside the baseball bat revealed its misty form. It glowed brightly. Its face covered the right side of Dan's face. He muttered that he was absolutely sick of bugs now. He stepped forward to face the huge bug. He charged toward it. As he ran, a teal mist trailed behind him. He gripped his baseball bat with both hands and swung it with all his strength. The strike tore one of the monster's arms off. After that, the right side of his face returned to normal. The huge monster collapsed. Some debris fell from the ceiling. Sunlight from the hole above illuminated the dismembered corpse. Dan was puzzled about how he suddenly became so strong. Finally, Dan was getting out of there. His bat turned back into mist again. That surprised him, but he figured it was going to eat the corpse again. He felt disgusted as he watched it eat. No matter how many times he saw it, he just couldn't get used to it. When it finished, the mist swirled around him. He was shocked when it suddenly entered his body. He clutched his shoulder tightly. Soon after, his wound healed. He liked that he was healing, but he still couldn't get used to the pain. And more importantly, with the power he now had. He realized it was on a completely different level compared to when he absorbed those other monsters. It made him think his power grows stronger the stronger his opponent is. He looked serious. He might not know what waits outside the cave, but he trusted that with his power he would manage somehow. He stepped out and was surprised by what he saw. It was a desert. A desert wasn't exactly a great place to be, but it was still miles better than that damp cave. A few minutes later, he dropped to his knees. His lips looked dry and cracked. He quickly realized he had been wrong. This place was far more desolate than he expected. There was no food, and no water either. The only things he occasionally ran into were walking skeletons, but they didn't surprise him anymore. After fighting so hard to survive, he might end up starving to death instead. Feeling weak, he lay down on the ground. There wasn't a single soul in sight. The only human-like things around were monsters. He began to think this might be a world where humanity had already perished. He closed his eyes, hoping that the next time he opened them, it would all turn out to be a dream. Suddenly, someone shouted that there was a person. It woke him up. A middle-aged man told the humanoid fox kid, Chloe, not to get close to Dan. She replied that the person was still alive. Dan was shocked. A moment later, Chloe looked annoyed. Dan was bawling his eyes out. She told him to stop crying, but he just couldn't. He was so relieved to meet them. They were the first people he had seen since arriving there, and they could actually talk to him. He cried so hard, it was honestly pretty ugly. The man told him to calm down so they could talk. Chloe couldn't believe he said that when they still had a long way to travel. He told her to look at how happy the guy was. They couldn't just ignore him. Besides, she was the one who ran over first because she saw he was alive. That made her blush. In the end, she agreed with him. He told her it was the right choice. They set up camp and cooked food over a bonfire. The pot smelled amazing. Dan stared at it intensely. It had been so long since he had seen real food. Chloe commented that he was acting like someone who had been starving for days. Dan replied that he hadn't eaten anything in over 5 days. She was shocked to hear that. She asked if it was even possible to survive that long. Dan said he wasn't completely sure, but he thought it was because he had been absorbing those monsters. The man said it sounded like some kind of magic he had never heard of. Dan was surprised to hear that magic existed in this world. Chloe found it hard to believe. She asked where he even came from. Dan admitted he didn't know where to begin explaining. The man told him to eat first. They could listen to his story while they ate, after they finished eating. They learned that Dan came from another world and had simply woken up there. And whenever he killed monsters with his blunt weapon, his body healed and grew stronger. They thought it was a very strange ability. Chloe noticed how quiet the undead were that night. Dan said he had taken them all out with his bat. Chloe was shocked to hear that, but deep down, the man knew something important. The undead in that place usually resurrect every night, no matter how many times they are destroyed. And yet, the undead that Dan had absorbed stayed motionless even after night fell. He wondered if there was something special about that strange weapon. He quietly observed Dan. Then he told Dan that thanks to him, he would finally get some decent sleep for once. He suggested that if Dan didn't have a destination in mind, he should travel with them, and he would help him find a way to return to his original world. Chloe couldn't believe that Ares had just said that. Ares looked Dan straight in the eyes. Dan looked back at him. Then Dan said he would be grateful for that. Chloe could only sigh. The next day, she was collecting cactus. She stored it in her small bag. Dan learned from her that it was actually edible. He praised her for knowing her stuff. She replied that it was just basic knowledge for surviving in such a barren desert. Dan stared at her with a huge grin on his face. She asked why he was looking at her like that. He said she reminded him of his younger sister when she was little. Chloe argued that she was a fully grown adult. So, Dan joined Chloe and Aries' group. While walking, they had a small chat. Dan asked Chloe if her ears were real, so she asked if people in his world didn't have them. He said no. As he traveled with them, he slowly learned many things about this world. From Chloe, who introduced her race as Beastian, he learned common sense and the knowledge needed to survive. She asked him what kind of races lived in his world. Dan replied that there were only humans. That made her say it sounded boring. She ran toward Ares when they caught up with him. From the middle-aged man named Ares, Dan learned about the ecology of monsters and the way they fight. The two of them also told him that they had come there to slay the leader of the monsters. Dan felt incredibly lucky. Even though he didn't know much about the people of this world yet, he knew one thing for sure. He had met some truly good people. Later that night, he held his lucky charm in his hand. He couldn't stop thinking. Ares asked him if he couldn't sleep. Apparently, he had come to check on him. Dan admitted that he had a lot on his mind. Ares asked if he was thinking about his home, and said he was curious about it too. After all, he had lived in this world for a long time, yet Dan was the first person he had ever met from another world. Dan replied that compared to this world, his was pretty boring, which made Ares conclude that it must be a very peaceful world. Dan could only smile. It suddenly hit him just how peaceful his old home really was. The life he once thought was miserable would be considered a luxury in this world. He even started talking about baseball with Ares. Dan made a firm decision to do whatever it takes to return. The next day, a large dragon-like monster was chasing them. The dying part definitely wasn't part of his plan. Dan and Chloe ran. He told her to go first. She worried about him, but he insisted that she hurry. He gripped his baseball bat tightly and smashed it into the dragon's face. The hit made it struggle to open its right eye. Dan had put everything he had into that attack. The dragon got annoyed. It tackled him, making him scream loudly. He was blasted away. The explosion made Chloe turn around. Dan writhed in pain. He glared at the monster. The dragon dove toward him, trying to eat him. He panicked, but suddenly, the huge monster was sliced open from its mouth all the way down its body. Then it collapsed on the ground. Aries had done it. He asked Dan if he was okay. Chloe immediately scolded him for being late. She asked Dan if he was hurt. Dan said it was nothing serious. His baseball bat began to glow. The creature came out and started eating the monster. Dan and Chloe's eyes widened in shock. Then Dan's wounds began healing. Soon he looked fine again. Chloe asked what that thing was. She asked if that was the absorption he mentioned before. Dan said it was basically that. Aries watched as the corpse and its mana vanished without a trace. Dan and Chloe happily talked about what just happened. But Aries looked serious. In a firm voice, he called Dan's name and told him there was something he wanted Dan to do. Dan and Chloe listened carefully. Later that night, Chloe screamed that he was insane. But Aries looked completely serious. She was furious that he was basically telling Dan to fight a lich. That was the same as telling him to die. The two of them talked away from Dan, but Chloe was still yelling. She reminded Aries that killing it according to the original plan should already be enough. Aries replied that if Dan refused, he wouldn't force him. She kept raising her voice, saying that the idiot didn't even know how strong a lich really was. She was suddenly interrupted when Dan said he would do it. Chloe was shocked. It left her completely speechless. Dan asked what he needed to do first. While eating dinner, they listened to Aries. Chloe asked him what exactly they needed to check. He explained that just like Chloe said, Dan didn't fully understand his own abilities yet. Dan admitted that was true. So before facing the lich, they needed to figure out his abilities in detail, like how they worked and what their limits were. Dan was curious about that too. He also wanted to know what kind of power his bat truly held, so he asked what they were going to do. The next day, he looked pretty dumb just sitting there. He wore a bored expression. He asked what they were doing. Chloe told him it was a mana scan. He got excited at the thought that he might have mana too, but they could only guess, since everyone technically has mana anyway. Aries told him he would just take a quick look, and they might learn something about the strange weapon and Dan's mana. Dan suddenly blushed and covered his body. Aries quickly said it wasn't that kind of inspection. He placed a hand on Dan's shoulder and began channeling mana. Aries closed his eyes. Then his consciousness was pulled somewhere else. In front of him was a misty, evil-like figure. A powerful wind suddenly blew, which forced him to pull his hand away from Dan's shoulder. He looked stunned. Dan asked if he was already done. He asked if Aries had discovered anything. Aries said no. Unfortunately, he had no idea. Dan simply said that was a shame. But deep down, Aries knew it wasn't normal mana at all. It felt like something else was living inside Dan's body, just sensing that mana caused a strong rejection. He could already tell that this power was dangerous. Under the bright sky, a skeleton wandered around. It sensed something and looked around. Suddenly, a pebble hit it right in the face, and it collapsed. Quite some time had passed since Dan fell into this world. He didn't know the exact number of days, but he guessed it had been over 3 months. During that time, he had absorbed countless monsters. His body had already gone far beyond that of an ordinary human. Someone called out to him. Even though the place was filled with unknown monsters, he had managed to endure because he wasn't alone. Chloe told him it was time to eat. Our MC happily finished his meal. He said it was a great meal. He praised Chloe for her amazing cooking. She puffed up with pride and said it was just a basic skill. Dan asked if they could look forward to dinner too. She told him he'd be surprised. Aries noticed something. Dan was surprisingly good with kids. He watched how Dan naturally pushed the dinner preparations onto Chloe. Aries asked if the thing he had been teaching him was going well. Dan asked if he meant the mana manipulation training. He admitted it wasn't going as well as he expected. He still couldn't feel anything. He thought it might be because he simply had no talent. Aries thought to himself that it was just as he expected. It had probably been too much to hope for. He had also noticed that Dan didn't seem to have any aptitude for magic, just like him. Aries told him not to feel too discouraged since he was already under the influence of mana. He said that if Dan kept working hard, he might be able to control mana someday. Dan smiled and said that even if he couldn't use mana, he had still become pretty strong. He hoped he could be helpful when they fought the lich or whatever it was. But Chloe and Aries both went quiet after hearing that. Then Aries spoke. He told Dan that there would be no situation where he would fight the lich directly. That completely confused him. Aries explained that from a normal point of view, Dan might seem strong enough, but he still wasn't at the level needed to face a lich. His role was simply to absorb the corpse after Aries defeated it. Dan replied that he understood. Aries added that it was for his safety, so he shouldn't worry too much about it. He told Dan they would reach their destination in a few days, so he should get plenty of rest. Dan replied yes. They continued their journey. At night, they fought the undead, and then had dinner. The next day, they continued walking and fighting, and at night they rested while Ares kept watch. Another day passed. Chloe said she was already exhausted. Ares told her to hang in there just a little longer. Once they reached the end of the canyon, the entrance to the tomb would be there. Dan offered to carry her bag. He put on her backpack and simply said, "Let's go." That made her smile. They traveled through the canyon. Chloe looked hopeful. Ares confirmed that she was right. Dan looked nervous. They finally reached the Lich's tomb. They went inside and walked down a staircase. They arrived in an empty room. Dan said the inside was cleaner than he expected. Chloe replied that hearing that somehow sounded ominous. Ares warned them not to lower their guard, since this was the kind of place where something could appear at any moment. Dan teased him, asking if he thought a ghost or something would actually show up. He paused for a moment. Then he joked that he already knew what Ares would say next, that it was standing right behind him. But the joke was on him, because there really was a ghost there, and it replied that he caught it. Dan screamed loudly. The ghost said hi, but Dan instinctively hid it. He cursed it for scaring him. Chloe asked if it was really possible to beat up a ghost with a club. Dan answered that having the determination to beat it up was what really mattered. While they explored the tomb, Dan asked Ares what kind of guy the Lich was. Ares stayed quiet at first. Then he said that the Lich was the ruler of the land of the dead. It resurrects and commands countless undead. When they entered another room, an undead suddenly appeared and surprised them. Ares continued, saying that if the Lich were resurrected and fully regained his strength, he would lead an army of undead to destroy the world. That was why they had to defeat him before he recovered his power. However, even if he was defeated, he would be resurrected again in 100 years through magic. That was until Ares saw Dan's ability. If Dan could absorb and completely destroy the undead, then it might even be possible to erase their master as well. Dan stared at him with wide eyes after hearing that. Then he said it might not be that difficult, though he wasn't sure if the club would work the way they hoped. It didn't absorb every monster, and he didn't really understand how it worked either. But he believed they would figure it out somehow. He wasn't paying attention to where he was walking. Chloe and Ares saw what was ahead of him and grew worried. Chloe told him to wait. Dan looked confused. He turned around and asked why they weren't coming. Ares suddenly shouted for him to get out of there immediately. A magic circle began to glow. Dan had no idea what they were talking about. And then, he vanished. Chloe and Ares froze. They were horrified. Dan was no longer with them. The hallway was silent, until someone suddenly ran past at full speed. It was Ares. And Chloe was in his arms. She asked him why the hell he was in such a hurry. She demanded to know what had just happened back there. Ares looked tense. He blamed himself for not thinking things through. Something like that could happen at any time in that place. He could only hope he wasn't too late. Meanwhile, Dan fell to the floor. He wondered what that light was just now. He looked around, having no idea where he was. Then he noticed something in front of him that made him jump. It was a huge door with a large skull carved on top. He definitely didn't expect to see that. It was the kind of door that practically screamed something horrible was waiting behind it. Still, he felt a little relieved that it wasn't some trap that chopped off limbs. Dan forced himself to stay calm and wait for Ares. At the same time, Ares was smashing monsters aside without even slowing down. He moved incredibly fast. Chloe asked him again what was going on. He told her that what Dan stepped on was the Lich's teleportation magic circle. She asked where it had taken him. If his guess was right, it would be the Lich's chamber. Dan looked around the room and felt horror crawl up his spine at what he saw. A dark, armored figure sat on a throne, wearing a horned helmet and layered black armor. A purple cloak draped over his shoulders as he rested his hands calmly, giving off the cold and intimidating aura of a dark ruler. But it wasn't moving. Dan felt nervous. He realized that it was the Lich, but it looked like it was asleep. He felt lucky. He thought that if he didn't wake it up, he might actually survive this. He really hoped that would happen, but there was a problem. He was already inside the room. Since there was a chance he might trigger another trap by accident, he decided to stay still and wait quietly in the dark. But then his baseball bat started glowing. He had no idea why it suddenly happened, especially since it had never done that before. The Lich opened its eyes. Dan immediately tensed. The Lich moved. Purple flames burst from its eyes as its dark, helmeted face stared forward, radiating a terrifying and overwhelming aura. The situation was nerve-wracking. It gripped its staff. Then it raised the staff as purple cosmic flames surged behind it, its dark armor glowing while a horrifying aura spread in every direction. Dan knew one thing for sure. He was screwed. Meanwhile, Chloe was shocked by what she had just learned. Ares sensed that the Lich had already awakened. Back to our MC, Dan's legs gave out, and he fell onto the floor. He could tell right away that this enemy was on a completely different level. The Lich pointed a finger at him, and power began gathering at its fingertip. Dan felt alarmed. A massive beam of purple energy shot downward and crashed into the ground in a violent explosion. Dan knew there was no way he could dodge it. He gritted his teeth and made up his mind to cut it down. He swung his bat and struck the powerful energy like it was a baseball. He poured all his strength into that swing. The attack was sent right back toward the Lich. Of course, the Lich didn't expect that. An explosion erupted in the air where the Lich was floating. Dan stared carefully. The dust slowly settled, and it revealed the Lich completely unharmed. Dan cursed in his head. It hadn't even flinched. He wondered how he was supposed to deal with a monster like this. The Lich moved its fingers again. Purple vines suddenly burst from the ground. They wrapped around Dan's arms and legs. He was completely restrained. The Lich glared at him. Then it spoke, saying that he possessed an unusual power. It asked if the source of it was his heart. The Lich reached out toward him. It said it would know the answer once it carved Dan open. Suddenly, a sword slashed through its arm. Both of them were shocked and turned toward the source of the attack. It was Ares. And this guy is just aura farming now. Dark energy swirled around his blade. He glared straight at the Lich. The vines were cut apart. Dan finally broke free. Ares asked if he was hurt anywhere. Then he told Dan to stand back, and that he would handle it from there. The Lich fired at Ares. The attack came from every direction. Explosions erupted all around them. Dan grew worried for Ares. The Lich calmly waited to see the result. Smoke covered the entire area. But through the smoke, Ares swung his sword and cut the Lich in half. The Lich hadn't expected that. Ares stepped out of the attack completely unharmed. The Lich's body, split in two, slowly merged back together. The Lich said that they truly shared a terrible fate that bound them together. It slowly brought its hands together in front of its chest. Purple energy gathered between its palms as dark power swirled around its armored body. A massive purple explosion of energy burst above it, spreading out like a giant star in the sky. Dan asked what it was. The Lich answered, "End of the star!" and launched it at them. It was a massive surge of ominous energy. Dan's eyes widened, and his mouth hung open as he stared at the overwhelming power. In front of him stood Ares, bracing himself. The purple energy detonated violently, blasting the ground apart and throwing rocks and debris everywhere. When the chaos settled, Ares was still standing in front of Dan, protecting him. His sword was stabbed into the ground, and he gripped it tightly. He looked exhausted, and the Lich still floated above them. The massive blast split apart and tore across the ground around them. Yet Ares and Dan stood in the only untouched spot, completely unharmed. Clearly, the Lich didn't expect that. It said that Ares had always faced him alone, yet this time he had brought a strange companion. That made it wonder if Ares had prepared some secret trump card to destroy its body. But Ares wasn't the only one who had prepared a gift. Once again, the Lich brought its hands together and activated a spell called Whisper of the Void. Ares immediately became wary. Suddenly, the surroundings around him blurred. The Lich now stood right beside him. It told him that this was a space created just for him. Ares asked if the Lich was planning to fight him in a one-on-one duel there. The Lich said that sounded nice, but its real plan was to open the gift Ares had brought. Dan was suddenly transported into that space as well. The Lich said it knew Ares had prepared a dagger meant to pierce its heart, but instead, that blade would be turned against him. Ares stayed silent. He couldn't even move a single muscle. He suspected it was a form of mental magic rather than true reality. He knew breaking free wouldn't be easy. Normally, he would take his time to analyze and dismantle the spell. But if he delayed now, Dan's life would be in danger. He could only hope Dan would hold on a little longer. Meanwhile, Dan was being ordered to offer himself up to the ruler of the dead and the terror of the living. A crushing pressure forced him to surrender everything. The Lich wanted his flesh and his power. Suddenly, a gigantic phantom beast appeared. Its glowing eyes and massive fangs towered over the battlefield. It answered the Lich with a clear refusal, saying the vessel belonged to it. The creature inside Dan's bat was furious that the Lich dared to step into its domain without fear. The Lich had no idea what was happening. Whatever this thing that was in front was definitely a lot more powerful than him. Moments later, Ari suddenly found himself back in the room. He stood there, stunned. The Lich's magic shattered. To his surprise, the Lich cursed at him for bringing something like this with him. Ares saw the opening. He stepped into a combat stance and struck the Lich. Ares looked completely serious. The moment the Lich was cut, Dan's beast rushed in and devoured it until nothing remained. Dan groaned in pain. Ares heard it and grew worried. Dan asked what had just happened. His baseball bat began glowing brightly. Suddenly, purple energy rushed toward Dan. Ares recognized it immediately. It was the Lich's mana. The energy wrapped around Dan, making him cry out in pain. Dark, sinister power flared from his body. The amount of mana was overwhelming. Ares worried about what might happen if Dan absorbed something like that. Dan clutched his chest tightly, his forehead pressing against the ground. Then he collapsed face down. Ares rushed toward him, shouting for him to stay conscious. He wondered if this was a backlash from absorbing the Lich. Suddenly someone spoke. "Lord Asclepius." Ares froze in shock. He slowly turned toward the voice. A woman had appeared. Dan heard someone calling his name. The voice told him to find Anir. As soon as he heard that, he woke up. He screamed loudly. When he looked around, everything was calm. That only confused him more. He searched for Ares and Chloe, but he couldn't find them anywhere. He wondered where they had gone. Then he noticed a bag and a note nearby. It was a note they had written, saying something urgent came up, so they had to move ahead first. They also said they managed to take down the Lich thanks to him. Unfortunately, Dan had never seen those letters before, so he couldn't read them. But more importantly, he had a bad feeling. He thought they might have just abandoned him. A little while back, Ares was in a foul mood. He asked the woman what brought her here. The woman was Aquinas. She was tall with long crimson hair, walking forward with calm grace. She wore a black dress decorated with a golden butterfly. The end of her gown spread out like butterfly wings. She smiled at him. She informed him that His Imperial Majesty had summoned him. Ares slid his sword back into its sheath. To him, this was sudden news. She asked him since when that had ever been a surprise. After all, His Majesty never asked for permission beforehand. Ares scowled. She told him they could discuss the details at the palace, since it looked like he had already finished his business here anyway. They were about to step into the portal when someone suddenly called out to Ares. They both turned toward the voice. It was Chloe. She asked if Dan was okay. Then she quickly asked what happened to the Lich, but when she saw Aquinas, she froze in alarm. Her expression turned furious. Aquinas simply waved at her like they were old friends. Then Chloe noticed Dan lying on the ground. She rushed over and tried to wake him. Ares told her to calm down. He explained that Dan had likely passed out from the shock of absorbing the Lich. His condition wasn't life-threatening. Aquinas simply watched the scene. Ares looked far from pleased. He clearly had more questions about this. But he had to leave. He called Chloe and told her to pack some food and a map in a small backpack, then leave it for Dan. Chloe was shocked, but she understood the mission. Aquinas watched them quietly. She had grown suspicious of Dan. After all, she had just heard that he absorbed the Lich. She found that rather amusing. It was a very interesting piece of information. She wasn't even able to hide her sinister smile. A few seconds later, she noticed it and quickly came back to her senses. At the same time, everything was prepared. Ares told them they could leave. They walked toward the portal, but Ares suddenly stopped beside Aquinas. He leaned closer and whispered a warning to her. It would be wise to drop her interest in that kid. That is, if she wanted to live a long life. Chloe looked back at Dan before stepping into the portal. Aquinas did the same. Dan was still lying there, sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the drama happening around him. She quietly muttered that she would keep that in mind. Then the portal closed. At the present moment, Dan whined that they were so mean. He felt really sad. They hadn't been together for long, but he already thought of them as family. He couldn't believe they just left him like that. For a moment, he even thought he was the only one who actually cared. After venting for a bit, he finally accepted that they probably had their reasons. Ares said they beat the Lich, thanks to him. But Dan honestly wondered if he had even done anything, and he definitely didn't feel any stronger, even though he supposedly absorbed it. He scratched his head and thought about it. If that was the case, he figured he should at least grab some loot to make up for it. They just defeated a massive boss, so there had to be something good lying around. He picked up a heroic-grade cursed elf skull orb. There was also a legendary-grade staff of pain and despair. Then he found a unique-grade screaming wicked demonic sword, a legendary-grade blood-stained ritual dagger, and a heroic-grade gruesome vengeful spirit warhammer. Dan stared at the pile of weapons, then decided to forget about them. Every single one looked like it could curse him for life. Yeah, hard pass. Soon, he stepped out of the tomb. He pulled out the map and compass. It was way harder than he expected. After all, he had spent his whole life navigating with phone apps. According to the map, there was a village past the forest to the west. It was far. Dan let out a long sigh. He was alone again. Still, he continued his journey. Along the way, he bumped into an undead. The skeleton staggered backward after the hit. 3 months had passed since he parted ways with Ares and the others. During that time, he crossed the wasteland alone. Thanks to the things Ares and Chloe taught him, he managed to survive without too much trouble. Even so, it was a very lonely journey. But finally, Dan was leaving that desolate place. He reached an area filled with lush grass and tall trees, the first greenery he had seen in almost a year. At last, something peaceful and beautiful. Not monsters, not endless sandstorms, just calm nature. Then suddenly, an explosion went off nearby. Dan just stared at the direction of the blast. He looked completely unimpressed. In that forest, someone was running incredibly fast. It was a blonde man who looked like an adventurer. He cursed in his head. He asked himself why this was happening. An attack almost hit him. The blast threw him away. He had no idea why this creature was there in the first place. It was a wyvern. He knew it was over for him. Even Robert, the strongest among them, was killed without being able to lift a finger. So, a bronze-rank hunter like him didn't stand a chance. They only came here to exterminate a few goblins, but instead they ran into this terrifying creature. It roared right in his face. He accepted that this was as far as he would go. Then suddenly, a figure charged straight into the wyvern's mouth. He opened his eyes and saw her. He recognized her. Alyosha. She called him Alt. She asked why he was just standing there and told him to get up immediately. He asked why she came back when he was supposed to be the bait so they could escape. She answered that she wouldn't let him play the lone hero. He felt touched by her words. He didn't argue anymore. He expected that she must have some kind of plan. She replied that if she had a plan, Robert wouldn't already be dead. She told him that on the count of 3, he should run without looking back. He said he understood. She started counting, but the wyvern attacked before she could finish, and it threw her away. Alt was shocked. He screamed her name. An arrow suddenly shot past him. It struck the wyvern in the face. Alt felt horrified, because another person he knew, Saris, had appeared there. She was the one who fired the arrow. She apologized to him and explained that she couldn't bring herself to run away alone. He yelled at her to get out of there immediately. The wyvern moved. It rushed straight toward Saris. She was about to be eaten. In that moment, she wished someone would come. Tears rolled down her eyes. Unexpectedly, someone came and smashed the wyvern's head. Karis and Alt were stunned. It was Dan. And our boy just bonked the shit out of the wyvern. Moments later, Alt and Saris sincerely thanked him. The wyvern died with a huge lump on its head. Dan told them it wasn't a big deal, but Alt quickly said it wasn't like that. Dan had just saved their lives. If he hadn't helped them, they would already be dead. Fortunately, Alyosha's life wasn't in danger either. But defeating a wyvern in one blow, that made Alt ask Dan something. Was he a high-rank hunter? Alt even guessed he might be gold rank, or maybe even platinum. But our MC didn't know what to say. They waited for his answer. Dan simply asked what they were talking about. The two of them looked confused. Dan had absolutely no idea what they meant. Moments later, Alt carried Alyosha as they continued on their way. Dan shared that he actually came from another world. He expected them to find it hard to believe, but Alt said their lifesaver wouldn't lie about something like that. Saris added that she had never heard of such a thing before, but teleportation magic already existed in this world, so traveling between dimensions might also be possible. Meanwhile, she carried the weapons of her fallen teammates. Dan offered to help her, but she said it would be too much to ask of him. Alt added that they didn't know everything about the world either, so they were open to strange possibilities. Dan realized that cases like his were probably very rare. Alt admitted that he was truly shocked earlier. A strange monster suddenly appeared and devoured the wyvern's corpse. Then it suddenly turned into a club. The weapon was radiating an incredible amount of mana. Alt asked if everyone in Dan's world had abilities like that. Dan was suddenly put in a tight spot, so he just replied, "Probably." It was easier than trying to explain everything. Finally, they arrived. Alt told him about the place. It was the easternmost territory of the kingdom of Lemenia, called Shiltrock. Moments later, we see Dan hold back his tears. Alt saw him and asked what was wrong. He wondered if the town just wasn't as impressive as Dan expected. Dan shook his head and said it wasn't that. It was just that. It had been so long since he'd seen this many people. Later that day, Dan ate heartily in a pub. He drank a lot, too. He looked completely satisfied. He never expected that his first legal drink as an adult would happen in another world. Not that he ever drank before, but still. The alcohol here tasted different. Alt and Saris told him they needed to look after their companion first. They had to treat Alyosha and recover Robert's body. Dan felt uneasy when he heard they had lost a comrade. Alt noticed the change on his face. He handed Dan some money and told him to rest at a nearby inn. They would meet him later. Dan accepted it and thanked him. He figured they would return once they finished their duties. By now, Dan's face was already flushed. Looking around at the world before him, he could no longer deny it. He had really come to another world. There were dwarves walking around, even beast-like humanoids. Dan started thinking about what he should do first. Then he decided. He should probably just sleep for now. The next day. His eyes were puffy when he woke up. He lay in bed and thought for a while. Sleeping in a real bed again made him lose track of time. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. Dan opened it and asked who it was. It was Saris. She asked if he had rested well. Behind her stood Alyosha. Dan stared at them blankly. He clearly wasn't expecting them. They all went downstairs. Someone immediately called for our MC. It was Alt, and he waved at him. Dan saw him and walked over. Soon the food was served. Alt told him that Alyosha insisted on seeing him to express her thanks. She looked a little shy. Alt also admitted that he was so out of it yesterday that he couldn't properly thank him. Dan told them it was nothing, and thanks to them, he got a good rest last night. Alt then formally introduced himself. He was a copper seal hunter from the Righteous Wanderers party. Alt was a human. Then he introduced Alyosha Wilder, and their party's only rear guard, Saris. She was also a human. Dan asked what hunter and seal meant. They looked surprised by the question. From their reaction, it seemed like he had just asked something very basic. Alt quickly realized his mistake. He remembered that Dan didn't know much about this place, so he explained that hunters were people who hunted wild animals or monsters or carried out various requests. To do that, they had to be affiliated with the Hunters Guild. Hunters were usually organized into parties. The minimum was 2 people, but 4 was the usual number. Seal referred to the rank given by the guild. In order, there were steel, copper, silver, gold, platinum, and mithril. Some parties had members with mixed ranks, but since requests could only be taken based on the lowest ranked member, most people preferred teaming up with others of the same rank. Steel and copper hunters usually hunted wild animals or small monsters. They also handled other small tasks. Silver seal hunters are veteran hunters who mainly focus on hunting monsters. Most people end their hunter careers without ever reaching the silver rank. Gold seals are hunters and high-level personnel. Even large guild branches might only have 3 or 4 parties worth of them. From gold rank onward, it's more common to lead a silver party than to form a party made up of only gold hunters. Alt said he wasn't sure about the exact number of platinum seal hunters, but he knew there were fewer than 20 in the entire guild. In fact, he had never met one in his life. Lastly, the mithril seal had only existed in 10 people throughout the continent's history, and among them, only 3 mithril seal hunters were currently active. They were basically living legends. Now Dan understood how impressive the ranking system was. The seal rank didn't just show strength, it also worked as proof of identity and a kind of credit rating. That was why lost hunter seals sold for high prices on the black market. Of course, pretending to be a hunter was a serious crime. To earn a seal, hunters had to complete many requests from the guild. Alt's team was a copper seal party. He admitted it wasn't something to brag about, but they managed to get by. Dan felt like his head might explode from all the information. Since they were already talking about it, Alt decided to ask something. He wanted Dan to join their party. Dan was stunned. Alt quickly clarified that he wasn't forcing him. But Dan didn't know much about this world. He probably needed money and some form of identification. And their party just happened to be missing 1 member. In other words, their interests lined up pretty well. Dan knew he needed to adapt to this society, at least until he figured out how to return home. For that, he needed money and knowledge. Alyosha said she had heard that Dan was incredibly strong. Alt and Saris told her that he took down a wyvern in a single blow, so they probably wouldn't have to worry about dying anytime soon. But suddenly someone called them liars. A loud smack hit the table. It was a blonde girl, and she accused them of making things up. Dan looked completely unimpressed. Alyosha told the girl, Mary, to stop bothering them and get lost. Mary mocked her and asked why a pet was sitting at the same table as people. She told Alyosha that since she was shedding fur, she should eat on the floor like the beast she was. This woman was the leader of the noble oppressors, Mary de Chatillon, a human. Alyosha was furious. Alt quickly tried to calm her down. Then Mary shifted her attention to Dan. He was a face she hadn't seen before. She asked if he was the one who caught the wyvern. Our boy simply answered, yeah. She asked if he had brought any trophies, since those could sell for a good price. Alt simply said there were circumstances. Mary scoffed. To her, that only proved they were lying. Dan raised his voice at her. He had been putting up with her nonsense, but now it was time for her to stop. Mary asked what he would do if she didn't. That made Dan snap. He cracked his knuckles and said this little pipsqueak was starting to get on his nerves. Mary was furious that he called her a pipsqueak. She fired back, calling him a lowlife who crawled out of some unknown hole. Being called a lowlife only annoyed Dan even more. Just then, an orange-haired man stepped in and apologized. Dan looked confused. The man simply smiled at him. Mary was annoyed that the man named Brian stepped in. He apologized to her and said they were the ones interrupting the meal. He suggested they head back to their table. Brian was a human from the noble oppressors. He pushed Mary toward their table while telling her they should just go eat. She screamed at him to let go of her. Dan was also getting annoyed with him. Dan grabbed Brian's shoulder and asked what his problem was. Brian's expression turned serious. He glared at Dan and suggested they call it a day. Dan was caught off guard. He sighed. Then he glared right back and said those two were already getting on his nerves. Silence filled the room. Dan and Brian stared each other down. Then a small person tapped Brian's leg and asked what was going on with the tense mood. She told Brian to stop as well. After all, Mary had started it. Brian could only sigh. The small girl apologized for the trouble. She explained that hearing someone take down a wyvern in one hit was hard to believe. That was why Mary had acted so rude. Her name was Erin. She was a dwarf. Dan simply stared at her. He couldn't believe that the tiny one was somehow the most mature person there. Of course. He wisely kept that thought to himself. Erin scolded Brian, reminding him that she sent him to mediate, not join the fight. Dan glanced toward his table. Alt and Saris both looked worried. So Dan simply said he didn't want any trouble. They could just take Mary and leave. Erin thanked him for understanding. Mary peeked out from behind Brian's back and stuck her tongue out at Dan. Dan's face immediately turned red with anger. He told them to get out before he did something he might regret. When he returned to his seat, Saris admired how well he handled it. She said Mary had a terrible mouth, but deep down she had a good heart. Dan quickly changed the subject and asked where they should start. He meant becoming a hunter. Later that day, Dan received a badge. Alt told him all he needed to do was pay the registration fee. Dan couldn't believe it was that simple. Alt then asked if he had any money, since the change he gave him earlier wasn't much. Dan said his travel buddy had left him some. He poured out the contents of the pouch. Dan looked confused when only one coin fell out. But Alt quickly noticed that it was a gold coin. One gold coin was worth 1,000 crowns. Each coin had a different value. A tin coin was worth 1 crown. Copper was worth 10 crowns. Silver equaled 100 crowns. And one gold coin was worth 1,000 crowns. Dan asked if that was enough. Alt told him the registration fee was 500 crowns. Dan was stunned that it cost half of his gold coin. Their table suddenly went quiet. Now that Dan was registered, Alt knew it was time to stop bothering him. Dan asked if they were leaving already. Alt explained that they had a lot to prepare before the raid. Besides, Dan needed time to rest and get ready himself. He told Dan they should meet again there in 3 days. Dan looked horrified at the thought. Alt understood how he felt. He told him the inn was run by the Hunter Guild. Most of the guests staying there were hunters, so Dan could use the time to make connections. And if he got bored, he could try completing a quest or two. If Dan was still solo in 3 days, they would take him in. Even if he didn't join their party permanently, they could still do the raid together. Dan said he would think about it. They said their goodbyes. Dan told them to get home safely. Once they left, Dan let out a long sigh. His morning had been incredibly hectic. He held a single gold coin in his hand. It was worth 1,000 crowns. Breakfast earlier had cost 3 crowns per person. With the meat, drinks, and the room from last night, the total had been 25 crowns. He quickly realized that meant he could afford about 20 days of room and board. Back home, that amount of money wouldn't even cover a few combo meals. Dan suddenly missed his house. He had been so close to living a comfortable life, and now he was back to struggling just to survive. With another sigh, he decided he should start preparing for a hunting quest. Moments later, he bought himself some gear. The shopkeeper looked him up and down and said he was a total tourist. She priced the gear at 230 crowns. Dan knew he was probably getting ripped off. He walked away feeling a little scammed. Still, he was just glad he didn't even try to buy plate armor. After that, he had no idea what to do next. Since he was running low on cash, he decided to take on a quest. He walked up to the guild receptionist. He placed a paper on the desk and said he wanted to sign up for a quest. She remembered him as the new guy from this morning. She politely told him that the quest he picked was for silver rank hunters and above. Then she pointed to the section where iron rank quests started. So, his grand, epic adventure began with hauling sacks of flour and cleaning out stables, plus doing a mountain of laundry. At this point, he couldn't even call himself a hunter. He felt more like a very underpaid handyman. Soon, the sun began to set. Dan returned to the inn looking like a zombie. He had spent the entire day doing back-breaking work. It definitely wasn't what he imagined when he signed up to become a hunter. He worked all day for a measly 30 crowns, living hand to mouth, just like always. Dan muttered to himself that life was a struggle no matter which world you lived in. As he walked down the street, he passed a food vendor. The man was selling grilled skewers. Dan immediately started drooling. He told himself that buying one wouldn't hurt. After all, he had worked hard today. So he bought a mystery meat skewer for 3 crowns. The moment he took a bite, his eyes widened. It was incredible. Even someone raised on instant ramen back home would absolutely love this. Dan wondered what the secret was. He was chatting with the vendor about the food when someone suddenly spotted him. This person pulled out a compass, and the needle pointed straight at Dan. She quietly watched him. At that moment, Dan was still asking the vendor why the food tasted so good. Suddenly, someone tugged on the hem of his shirt. She said she had finally found him. Dan turned and saw a small woman with elf ears and red hair. She wore a witch's hat. She smiled brightly at him and called him her destiny. Moments later, we see Dan listen to the woman. She told him he was her destined hero. He asked for proof. She said it came from her master's prophecy. According to the prophecy, the one the compass points to is the hero who will save the world, and she is the one meant to assist him. Naturally, Dan had a hard time believing something like that, but she had no doubt at all. Her master was Denise, the witch of prophecy. Dan asked if she was famous. The woman proudly said her master's prophecies had never been wrong. When her master's shoulder aches, she predicts rain. And sure enough, it rained that very day. Dan said that just sounds like weather forecasting. That instantly made her angry. She accused him of speaking blasphemy and demanded he take it back right now. Dan quickly apologized and took it back. No need to start a religious war over weather. Then he asked what happens now if he really is this destined hero. She explained that her master told her to aid the destined hero. Whatever he plans to do, her magic will surely help him. Dan asked what she thinks he plans to do. She answered with full confidence. He will save the world. Dan cut her off immediately and said she was wrong, because his only goal is to return to his own world. That answer confused her. Dan told her he has no idea who her master is, or what this hero nonsense is about. And he has absolutely no intention of saving the world. He has a million reasons to get back home as fast as possible, so he told her to go find someone else. He had no idea what she's looking for, because he was certain that it wasn't him. Then he left. His words made her sad. Mary saw it happen. She had a huge grin as she commented that the woman looked like she got dumped. Brian told her to stop prying into other people's love lives. He suggested that if she had nothing better to do, she should just come help him out. She answered that he doesn't get it. Other people's lives are the highest form of entertainment. He answered that while she was enjoying her entertainment, he was stuck doing the annoying paperwork that was supposed to be handled by the party leader. She screamed that handling that stuff for her was the entire reason for his existence. She argued that nobles have plenty of other noble duties. Brian noticed that the woman was the disciple of Denise, the witch of prophecy. That was some interesting information. Back then, Denise gave her disciple a compass. It was a magical artifact that would guide her to her destiny. She told her disciple, Ariel, to go, and just like that, Ariel set off toward her destiny. though what awaited her next was something she never expected. At the present moment, Dan hauled some sacks. He was sweating buckets. The old woman thanked him for his work. Dan greeted her happily. He walked over and chatted with her. Ariel watched him from afar. She couldn't understand why he spent the whole day doing menial chores. The old woman told him he had done a great job, so she added a little extra pay. Dan thanked her. Ariel wondered if he was completely broke. She questioned whether he was really the person her master had spoken about. She wondered what she should do now. She snapped out of her thoughts when Dan spoke to her. He couldn't believe she was still there. He already knew she had been following him the whole day. He told her to give it a rest and go back to her master or wherever she came from. He insisted he wasn't the destined hero or whatever she believed. She answered that her master had passed away. Dan immediately apologized. She remembered that he wanted to return to his original world. So, she decided to help him. Whether it was finding a way home or just cleaning out a barn, either way, she was determined to help him. The next day at the guild, Alt was putting on his armor. He was sitting in a corner. Someone called out to him. It was Saris. She said she couldn't find Dan anywhere, and it didn't look like he was in his room either. Alt found that strange. Someone then pointed out that it was obvious. Dan had run away. It was Mary. She said that after bragging so loudly about killing a wyvern in one blow, he probably got scared the truth would come out. Alt noticed she was wearing full armor. He asked what she was doing there. It seemed like he hadn't heard. She told him there had been reports of monsters appearing near Shiltruk that don't belong in that area. So naturally, their party, the noble oppressors, graciously volunteered to search the surrounding territory, and one of their tasks was supervising a group of rookie hunters who had just lost half their fighting strength. Alt said he could tolerate her belittling him and Saris, but he warned her to stop insulting Dan. A woman with eyeglasses and sheep horns from Mary's party asked who Dan was. Brian couldn't answer her directly. The woman was Veronica, a white-wall bestian from their party. Saris shouted that Dan saved their lives, and if Mary kept disrespecting him, she wouldn't stand for it. Mary scoffed and said their savior was busy with his love life. Saris asked what she meant. Mary said there was some elf girl talking about destiny and things like that. She added that the two of them were probably getting a little too cozy to remember his promise. Saris stepped closer, a dark aura forming around her, and said it was a lie. Mary froze. Saris said Dan told them he came from another world and didn't know anyone except them. Yet somehow, after only 3 days, he suddenly had a lover. That was complete nonsense. She made it clear her patience was running out. Then someone spoke up, asking who exactly had run away. Everyone turned toward the voice. Brian looked calm, but Alt looked surprised. It was Dan. And Ariel was standing right behind him. Dan happily greeted everyone. But what he said next would surprise them even more. Alt was happy to see him. Dan smiled back at him. He said he hoped he wasn't late. Mary immediately accused him of being a traitor. Ariel and Dan were both speechless. Mary scolded Dan for ditching the people he was supposed to party with just to join someone else. And while this was happening, notice the dark aura surrounding Saris. I think this girl is jealous. Anyway, Mary called him a shameless backstabber. Dan was getting annoyed with her and asked why she was even meddling in this. Alt said it wasn't mandatory, so he didn't mind. Still, it was completely unexpected. He was talking about the elf mage. He asked how they met. Saris was still giving off a very dangerous aura. Dan said it was a long story. Ariel calmly said she was the one who found him. That destiny had led her to his side. Dan couldn't believe she actually said that out loud. Alt and Mary both started blushing. Meanwhile, Saris looked like she was about 2 seconds away from committing murder. Brian was sitting at another table, quietly listening, but even he started blushing. He thought the place was suddenly serving up some top-tier romance drama. Dan quickly yelled at Ariel not to say it like that because people would get the wrong idea. Alt asked for her name. She gave it to him. Then he asked if she would be joining the subjugation. She said yes, but made it clear she had no interest in anything except helping Dan. She even got her hunter's license yesterday for that exact reason. Brian thought she looked like the devoted wife type. Veronica commented that she seemed too pure. Alt told them that Alyosha couldn't come because her injuries hadn't fully healed yet, so having more people was reassuring. Dan apologized for not discussing it first. Alt said it was fine. Since everyone was already there, Alt suggested they head out. Everyone agreed. Goblins are small monsters that possess the intelligence of a young child. They're naturally hostile and can use crude tools. They mainly raid human settlements to steal livestock and property. While a single goblin is not a major threat, their habit of traveling in packs makes them a serious nuisance. Alt explained that lately there have been frequent reports of goblin raids on small villages around the outskirts of Shiltrock. The last time they went searching for a goblin colony, they ended up getting attacked by a wyvern, and that was when they met Dan. Now Dan finally understood what had happened. He got the situation, but he still didn't understand why Mary's party was following them. Alt explained that between the wyvern incident and everything else, there had been a strange surge of monsters near Shiltrock. So he believed they were there to investigate the anomaly and provide protection. Mary told Dan he should feel honored, because they had personally graced him with their presence just to protect steel badge nobodies like him. Dan was clearly getting annoyed. He asked if there was really no one else they could send, besides those people. Alt understood that Dan might still be displeased given how they first met, but despite appearances, the noble oppressors were actually a very promising party. Even though they were a new party only in their second year, they had already been promoted to silver badge status in just one. They had performed brilliantly and were currently candidates for the fastest promotion to gold badge. Dan still looked skeptical about them. Mary turned to Ariel and asked where she was from. Brian quickly tried to stop her, but Ariel looked completely uninterested in the question. Alt admitted that they were certainly unique individuals. Dan muttered that one of these days he was going to smack that arrogant brat upside the head. Before they continued, Alt remembered something he needed to confirm. Since Dan used a blunt weapon, he would take the front line. Saris and Ariel would take the rear. He then asked Ariel what kind of magic she specialized in. She looked confused by the question and asked what he meant. Alt wondered if his question had been difficult to understand. He admitted he wasn't an expert in magic, but he had heard there were several major classifications: destruction, augmentation, alchemy, summoning, and necromancy. For example, Veronica was proficient in augmentation magic. Most mages have a main magic type, so he thought knowing Ariel's would help with their strategy. He shyly admitted that this was his first time being in a party with a mage. Mages are so rare that most people barely see even one until they reach silver badge rank. Now she knew what he meant. She was about to answer, when an arrow suddenly appeared an inch from her face. She wasn't hit because Dan caught it in time. Everyone was on alert. It was fired by goblins, and none of them had sensed them coming. Dan glared in the direction of the shot. Brian immediately shifted into combat mode since there was a goblin ambush, but Mary stopped him. She told him there was no need for them to intervene. She wanted to leave it to Alt's party since they were proper hunters after all. The goblin screeched loudly, but before it could even move. It was already hit by Dan's baseball bat. Dan then noticed the other goblins. Some were already slashed to death, and others had arrows sticking out of them. He looked at his party members and commented that it was easier than he thought. Alt told him his skills were impressive as always. Sarah said it was strange that goblins would ambush armed hunters. Alt agreed since goblins usually target the weak, so they normally go after children or the elderly first. And though he wasn't sure if it was intentional, they aimed for Ariel, their mage, first. Regardless, they still had to find and clear the goblin colony, because there was a high chance this wasn't all of them. Dan suddenly realized something. He should have left one alive. He asked if they should head deeper inside now. Saris and Alt's jaws dropped. Even Ariel looked alarmed. Meanwhile, Dan kept asking what this colony even looked like. Mary was shocked, too. Dan just kept yapping. Seeing that no one dared to make a sound, he was puzzled. He asked if something was wrong. He had no idea that a giant red monster was looming right behind him. Alt screamed at him to look behind him. Dan slowly turned around. The monster's claws were already swinging toward him. Mary charged forward with her lance and knocked the arm away. She was already in full combat mode. Dan and Alt were both surprised to see her step in. They hadn't expected Mary to move first. Brian told Dan to stay back. Their party would handle it from there. Dan was speechless. Brian looked completely serious. They didn't expect a rock mountain troll to appear so close to the fief. He told Mary that something strange was definitely going on. Mary warned everyone not to let their guard down, because that monster was not an easy opponent. Dan said he would join the fight too, but Alt immediately told him no, because he would only get in their way. Alt admitted that Dan was strong. However, the noble oppressors were also an experienced party. If Dan jumped in now, there was a high chance it would disrupt their coordination. So Alt suggested that they trust them for now. Dan thought about it. Ariel simply sighed. Brian gave Veronica a signal. She began chanting and activated her battle spirit fortification. The spell boosted her party members. Alt was surprised that she applied fortification magic to 3 people at the same time. The rock mountain troll locked onto them. Then it lunged forward, straight toward Mary. She raised her shield. and managed to block its claws. But the impact was heavy. The monster pushed her back. At the same time, Erin aimed her crossbow at the monster. She fired an arrow just as Brian charged forward. It hit the rock mountain troll in the eye. It staggered backward. Brian called out to his lady. She already knew what to do. She positioned her shield so he could step on it and launch himself high into the air. Then she entrusted the monster to him. Brian gripped his sword tightly and slashed at the other eye. Blood burst out like a fountain, making the rock mountain troll roar in pain. Dan was stunned by how incredible they were. Each member moved as if they were part of the same body. They looked like a real team that had trained together hundreds of times. Brian landed beside Mary. He had blocked the troll's vision, but the wound was shallow. With a troll's regenerative power, it would heal in an instant. This was the worst possible matchup for them since they had no real magical attack. Mary suggested they aim for the heart, the source of its regeneration. She told Veronica to get ready. The Noble Oppressor Party was known as a highly refined team because of their smooth coordination and stable positioning. But they also had one fatal weakness. It was their destructive power. Erin's crossbow was slow to reload, making it hard to deal serious damage to giant monsters. Brian, who fought on the front line with Mary, used 2 short daggers, which were poorly suited for fighting large monsters. Veronica, the party's only mage, could only use fortification magic, so her offensive ability was almost non-existent. Mary, who stood on the front line, used a unique weapon called a lance. And since a lance is normally designed for mounted combat, its center of gravity leans toward the rear, making it difficult for a foot soldier without mobility to unleash its full power. However, the Noble Oppressor Party compensated for this in a rather unusual way. They focused their fortification magic entirely on one person, and in this case, that person was Mary. Veronica cast strength fortification, speed fortification, durability fortification, and weapon fortification on her. Mary, a heavy infantry fighter, suddenly gained explosive strength and speed from the stacked fortification spells, and finally, she reached a speed that even cavalry couldn't match. When Saris saw it, her jaw dropped. Meanwhile, Ariel watched closely. Because of this, Mary earned a nickname inside the Hunter Guild. They called her the Golden Unicorn. The Rock Mountain Troll barely reacted before it noticed how fast she was moving. In the next instant, she blasted straight through the left side of its body. She came out the other side with a grin. Alt and Dan just stood there with their mouths wide open. They could literally see her through the massive hole in the troll's body. Mary proudly declared that a troll was nothing against her. She even started bragging about their party. But she never finished her sentence. She suddenly vomited blood. Alt and Saris froze in shock. Brian rushed straight to her. He scolded her immediately because that method puts extreme strain on her body. Mary simply said that a noble must always lead by example. To her, that much sacrifice meant nothing. She then told them they should return for now and request reinforcements. Unfortunately for them, the situation was far from over. An arrow suddenly pierced straight through her chest. Brian's eyes widened in pure shock. Even Mary looked confused. Her legs weakened, her face quickly turned pale. From the dark forest in front of them, several monsters slowly appeared. They marched out one by one. Goblins and trolls. Brian stared ahead and asked what on earth that was. There were way too many of them. Alt felt a chill run down his spine. He asked where all those monsters even came from. Mary called out to Veronica. Veronica jumped in surprise. Mary told her to take Erin and the others and get out of there. She would buy them some time. Erin immediately looked worried for her. Brian was about to speak. Mary already knew what he wanted to say, but she begged him not to say it. She reminded him about noblesse oblige, and said that now, it was her turn to fulfill her duty as a noble. Brian's expression twisted in pain. Then the tense moment suddenly broke when someone spoke up and told her not to be so dramatic. The voice said there's a limit to how much she can look down on a guy. It was Dan. He asked her if she really thought he would just run away and leave her behind. Everyone stared at him in shock. Even Saris and Ariel didn't expect that. Mary frowned and told him to stop being stubborn and leave, especially after seeing the fight earlier. Besides, she said he couldn't even scratch a troll with that crude weapon, and even if he somehow got lucky and killed one, there was no way he could handle all of them. Dan simply shrugged and said, they looked like a cakewalk compared to what he fought with Ares. Unfortunately for him, that only made Mary angrier. She shouted at him to stop talking nonsense and get moving, because they didn't have time for this. Right then, a troll raised its fist and swung at her, Mary saw it coming, and she knew she was doomed. But Dan stepped in. With a single swing of his bat, he blew the monster's arm clean off. Mary and Brian were completely stunned. The troll grabbed its bleeding shoulder and roared in pain. Then Dan casually called out to the veteran hunter. He asked her what the plan was. He also pointed out that everyone else was waiting. Mary just stared at him, completely dumbfounded. Alt quickly added that they were going to fight too. Aaron stepped forward and asked what kind of teammates would abandon their own leader. Mary froze. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she took a breath, and her expression turned serious. She ordered Brian and Saris to focus on the goblins first. There were too many trolls, so they had to deal with them one at a time. They would distract the trolls, while Dan handled them. But suddenly someone said, "Hold on." It was Ariel. She calmly said she would take care of it. Dan blinked in surprise. He asked if she actually had a plan. Ariel simply grinned. Then she reminded Alt about the question he asked earlier. The one about her primary magic. She revealed that she didn't have one. Mostly because there wasn't any magic she couldn't use. She activated mana augmentation, then stacked it with focus augmentation, then layered it with elemental augmentation, lifting herself into the air. Fire began gathering at the tip of her staff as she activated Rising Dragon Flame. A massive tornado of fire burst into existence. It swallowed the monsters whole. Flames tore through the battlefield and burned a huge section of the forest. Ariel's expression stayed calm and serious. Everyone could only watch as the forest turned into an inferno. After a moment, she slowly descended back to the ground. Dan just stared at her, completely starstruck. Ariel turned toward them. She smiled softly and said the problem was solved. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Only the crackling sound of burning monsters filled the air. Mary let out a quiet laugh. She said the whole thing was completely absurd. And then, she collapsed. Brian rushed to her in panic. Her complexion looked worse than ever. The doctor informed them that Mary had been struck by a lethal poison. It appeared to be a rare toxin, something that couldn't normally be found anywhere near this region. The doctor explained that he had already done everything he could, but unless they found an antidote soon, he couldn't guarantee that Mary would survive. Brian quietly said he understood. Meanwhile, Dan wondered if Mary would be all right. Ariel stayed silent. Dan looked around and thought it was strange. Since Mary used to be a noble, he expected her to be treated in some grand mansion, so he couldn't understand why they brought her to such a rundown place instead. Aaron then revealed that Mary wasn't a noble anymore. Dan blinked in surprise. He asked what she meant by that. After all, Brian followed her everywhere and kept calling her my lady. Aaron explained that Mary really did come from a noble family, and it was also true that Brian had once been her servant. But all of that was in the past. Long ago, when Brian was still young, he was a prisoner being transported. The carriage carrying him was large and surrounded by soldiers. Those soldiers carried a red flag with a black emblem. Several other prisoners sat inside the cart with him. One of them was a middle-aged man. The man asked the boy what crime he committed to end up there. Brian stayed silent. The old man shrugged and said he could keep it to himself if he wanted. After all, everyone captured during the war usually ended up at the gallows anyway, so the charge didn't really matter. Meanwhile, the guards riding behind the cart complained to each other. One of them said it would be easier to just execute criminals like that on the spot. He didn't understand why they had to go through the trouble of transporting them. His partner answered that it was for appearances. At the very least, they had to pretend there was some process. But the truth was obvious. Most of the people inside that cart probably weren't even serious criminals. There simply wasn't time for trials during the war. So, they were rounding people up and dealing with them all at once. Hearing that made the situation even worse. One guard then warned the other to be careful. Talking like that could get him into trouble. Unfortunately for them, they never finished that conversation. An arrow suddenly pierced straight through the guard's neck. He choked as blood poured out. The soldiers immediately shouted that they were under attack. Brian saw everything clearly since he was sitting near the cart door. A blue flag with a yellow rose waved in the wind. Moments later, several knights in blue capes charged forward. They wore full armor and rode powerful horses. The knights in red uniforms stood no chance. The attackers quickly cut them down. After the fight ended, the knights reported to their lord. They pointed toward the cart and asked what they should do with the 3 prisoners. The young knight riding at the front spoke first. He told their father that criminals like them should simply be executed right there. The middle-aged prisoner trembled in fear. Then one of the knights slowly approached the cart. Brian looked back at them. The lord asked them what their crimes were. The middle-aged man hurriedly explained that they were just thieves. At worst, they had only been scavenging bodies on the battlefield. The Lord slashed the man without warning. He then glared at the other prisoner. The man froze in shock, and a moment later, he was taken down as well. Brian simply kept his head lowered. The Lord observed him and said that for someone so young, he looked lifeless, like a candle that had already burned out. He asked Brian if he truly had no attachment to life left. Then he asked him what his crime was. Brian slowly lifted his gaze and glared at him, and told him to just kill him already, if that was what he planned to do. He even mocked him, asking if he was afraid of killing a brat without reason. The knight standing beside the Lord reacted immediately, but the Lord only chuckled in amusement, because this kid had guts. He liked him. In fact, he said the boy would make a perfect gift for his youngest daughter. He ordered his men to place the boy in the carriage. The knight called out to his father in surprise. Just like that, Brian was about to become a slave. It only confirmed what he already believed, that his life was nothing but garbage. But strangely, when he was brought back, they allowed him to soak in a warm bath. And Brian couldn't understand why he was being treated this way. Earlier, the moment he arrived, the maid immediately complained that he reeked. She refused to let him meet the young lady in that state. She told him to go wash himself until his skin was practically raw. So, now, Brian couldn't believe that a slave like him was sitting in a bath. It felt like ridiculous treatment. He even wondered if this household simply had money to burn. Then another thought crossed his mind. These people were fearless, trusting a criminal like him near their lady. Still, he couldn't help being curious about what she looked like. The knight beside him warned him not to even think about disrespecting the lady. And he added that if Brian tried anything funny, death would be the least of his worries. Brian found the knight extremely noisy. Then someone suddenly announced that the lady was coming. She descended the staircase with calm, graceful steps. Then she asked if he was the one her father had sent as a gift. Brian looked down at her, because she was tiny. The young Mary poked him and said her father told her he had picked him up from the streets and that he looked shabby and completely unrefined. Brian was already starting to get annoyed, but then she smiled brightly and said that since he was her father's gift, she would treasure him. Brian remained completely nonchalant. She asked him what his name was. He answered that it was Jared. She commented that it sounded like a very unrefined name, and Brian quickly realized she had a real talent for ticking people off. He couldn't believe they expected him to spend the rest of his life serving this brat. In his head, he rejected the idea immediately. Then she suddenly said, "Brian." Brian blinked in confusion. Then she clarified that it would be his name from now on. She extended her small hand toward him and said she was looking forward to working with him. Brian's brows furrowed. In his mind, the name Brian sounded incredibly corny. Someone once said that humans are creatures of adaptation. Instead of stealing from the streets or committing robbery, Brian now spends his days doing household chores he had never even tried before. Instead of stuffing stolen food or nearly rotten scraps into his mouth just to survive, he now eats warm meals prepared just for him. Instead of people holding grudges against him or coming to kill him, people filled with kindness and goodwill now approach him. It has only been a few months since he started living like this, but it already feels comfortable and natural, almost like he had lived this way from the beginning. Linda, the maid, asked him if he could endure it. He answered that it was all right. She studied him for a moment and placed a hand on his forehead, just as she thought. He really did look better with his forehead showing. It made him blush. He quickly turned away and asked what that was about all of a sudden. However, there was one troublesome thing in his life. Someone suddenly called out to him loudly. So he went to Mary's room. Mary immediately told him that she wanted to eat some sweets. His biggest problem was the young lady who called for him anytime she wanted without any warning. He told her to ask the maids instead, but she replied that her mother told her she must not have any sweets, and the maids would not listen to her. He stared at her, and she puffed her cheeks and started pouting. He could only sigh. So he brought her some macarons, and it instantly made her happy. She ate them eagerly. Then she proudly declared that this was exactly what she expected from Brian. He had managed to sneak sweets in despite such tight security. She asked if he used to be an incredible thief. Brian was no longer the street vagrant named Gerard. Now he was Brian, an attendant of the House of Chatillon. A few years passed. Mary still calls out to him. He glanced at her. Mary happily shared the news that her father had returned from his campaign. It was the news Brian had been waiting for. The head of the House of Chatillon, Resli Chatillon, a human, had returned. His wife, Catherine Chatillon, also a human, welcomed him home. He said it felt good to be home after so long. Mary called out to her father. She rushed toward him and hugged him. He was happy to see his daughter. He realized she had grown so much that he almost did not recognize her. He then looked at Brian, who bowed to him. Some men arrived and asked Mary if she was only happy to see their father. She turned to them with a wide grin. She said she was happy to see her brothers, too. The eldest son of House Chatillon, Léon Chatillon, a human, said she had become quite a lady now. The second son of House Chatillon, Renaud de Chatillon, a human, teased her that she was only as tall as a chestnut. He rubbed her head and asked if she had been doing well. She whined that her hair would get messy. Leon tapped Brian's shoulder. He thanked him for taking good care of his sister. Brian felt touched by the eldest young master's gesture. It had been a long time since they had all gathered together, so the head of the house suggested they share a meal. In the dining area, everyone gathered and the food was served. Raisley ate his steak. Mary looked very happy as she chatted with them. Her brothers were enjoying the moment too. It was a peaceful scene. Watching them even made Brian smile. After the meal, the table was cleared. Raisley then walked over to Brian. He said he wanted to talk for a moment. Brian did not expect that, under the moonlight. They shared a few drinks. It had been 5 years since Brian started living there. Raisley asked him if life had been manageable. Brian thought carefully before answering. Then he said it had been more than he could have ever asked for. That answer made Raisley smile. He told Brian that he looked very different from the man he saw 5 years ago, a man who was alive, but wished he was dead. Brian said it was all thanks to him. He had given a dying man another chance at life and a reason to keep living. Raisley then asked him about the life he owed him, and if he was willing to use that life for his sake. Brian had not expected that question at all. While they were talking, several men on horseback approached the mansion. Those knights carried burning torches. Their commander raised his hand and gave the signal. That night, their target was the mansion. That night, Brian rushed to Mary's room. She woke up and asked what brought him there at that hour. He shouted for her to flee immediately. She had no idea what on earth he was talking about. Meanwhile, outside, Raisley was smiling, but it was clear that he was furious. He was staring at a man named Jeffrey, the commander of the knights surrounding his home. Jeffrey Lutz, a human, and the head of the Noble Association of the Central Kingdom. He said this was the only way for them to survive. Leon stood beside his father. Raisley and Leon, along with their guards, stood outside the gate of their mansion. And what Jeffrey said only made Raisley angrier, because Jeffrey planned to survive by betraying his own liege and becoming the Empire's lapdog. Jeffrey was caught off guard by that statement. He simply replied that he respected the fact that Raisley had remained loyal until the very end, but not everyone could choose an honorable death like him. Meanwhile, Chloe was being dragged along by Brian. They ran as fast as they could. She asked him where they were going. He replied that there was no time to explain. They just needed to get out of there immediately. Earlier, while he was having a drink with Raisley revealed that a bloodbath would soon sweep through this place, and he entrusted Mary to Brian. Brian asked what would happen to his lord. Raisley simply told him to fulfill his responsibility, and he would fulfill his. At that moment, Raisley mocked Jeffrey. He said Jeffrey should not try to capture him with only a handful of soldiers. Jeffrey replied calmly that he would never come empty-handed to face the man known as the strongest in the Central Kingdom. Raisley's eyes widened. He saw the zodiacs. The creature had a massive, bulky silhouette. Raisley grew furious. He shouted that Jeffrey had brought the enemy commander into the royal capital. A few minutes later, the mansion burned. The maids had been stabbed. Mary saw everything. Corpses were scattered across the garden. She stopped and stared blankly. Brian yelled at her, telling her they had to leave now. He grabbed her shoulder and shouted that they did not have time for this, so she needed to pull herself together. Mary's voice trembled as she asked what in the world was happening. Brian grabbed her wrist and dragged her along. Then he opened the door and asked Linda if the horses were ready. But to their surprise, a man stood there with a sword in his hand, while Linda's body lay nearby, covered in blood. The man simply watched them. At this point, Linda had already lost her life. Brian's eyes widened. The man told them they had arrived at the perfect time, and that they should not be afraid, because it would all be over before they even felt the pain. But suddenly, someone almost struck that man. The attacker landed right in front of them. Clearly, the enemy had not expected this person. It was Reynold. His expression was deadly serious. He pointed his sword at the culprit and ordered Brian to take Mary and leave. Brian hesitated. He was worried about the second young master. Reynold shouted at him to go immediately. Brian's face twisted in pain. Still, he dragged Mary away while she screamed for her brother. Brian forced himself to keep moving. Mary cried uncontrollably as he pulled her away. She kept looking back at her brother. Meanwhile, the enemy sighed in annoyance. He said he had only been told to catch a few fleeing small fry, but he did not expect such good luck. He recognized Renaud, the second son of the Chatillon family, the greatest knightly house in the Central Kingdom. He never thought he would get the chance to clash with him. Renaud replied that he had already heard the rumors about a man named Hugo Fagati. At the same time, a horse raced through the night. Brian and Mary were riding it as they fled into the forest, far away from the mansion. Mary was sobbing uncontrollably. Brian was clearly trying to hold back his own emotions. They had escaped, at the present moment. The fireplace burned while Brian sat there, lost in thought. He stayed beside Mary. Then someone announced that the guild's investigation results were in. It was Alt. He reported that magic traces were found on the corpses of the monsters, which meant it was most likely the work of beast tamers. Brian, who was on the second floor, spoke up to confirm it. Everyone turned to look at him. They did not expect him to come out. Aaron asked what the doctor had said and whether Mary was okay. Brian quietly looked at them. Then he called out to Dan and Ariel. He asked them to lend him their strength. In another setting, a woman said something felt strange. She had already provided the funds, manpower, monsters, poison, and even perfect timing. In her eyes, she had given them everything. This was Aquinas de Callis, a human. She asked the man standing in front of her why he still failed. The man apologized and explained that a mage suddenly interfered. He begged for another chance. He was the only one left alive. The other culprits had already been cut down, their bodies scattered. Aquinas decided that she had already given him more than enough chances. Another man searched one of the corpses and pulled something out of its pocket. It was a vial filled with blue liquid. This man was Hugo Fagati, a human and a lieutenant under Ares. He asked Aquinas if she was really going to give up on Shiltrock just like that. She replied that it could not be helped. The surprise attack had failed, so the security in the territory would now be much tighter. And the Hunter Guild would most likely increase their investigation. She was worried the guild might notice if they tried anything too direct. And above all, she did not want to get on Asclepius's bad side. After all, this had started as something she half-jokingly proposed. She told Hugo that she would be heading back. Hugo simply watched her. He said he would stay because he still had unfinished business. He watched her leave. Then, he muttered that there was something he had failed to settle a long time ago. He was talking about Mary. Meanwhile, a man was being beaten. His hands were tied, and he collapsed face down on the ground. The attacker said he was not in a patient mood right now. That attacker was Brian. He warned the man. It would be better for him if he started telling the truth. Dan was with him. He was guarding the other men they had tied up. He looked uneasy. Meanwhile, Ariel simply sat to the side. She looked like she was sleeping. The man who had just been hit shouted that he knew nothing. He said they had never seen any beast tamers or trolls. Brian did not believe him. There was no way a man who knew every little thing that moved in and out of this area could have missed a group of monsters and mages of that size. After all, shaking down guys like this was their specialty. But the man insisted there was no reason for him to lie. Brian became so irritated that he raised his blade and prepared to stab him. The man shut his eyes and braced himself. But suddenly, someone grabbed Brian's wrist. Brian glared at the person who stopped him. It was Dan. Dan told him that was enough. He reminded Brian that he only came to help find Mary's antidote. He had absolutely no intention of helping with murder or torture. Brian pulled his arm free. He said Dan would not have to dirty his hands. Dan argued that standing by and watching was no different from murder. Brian went silent. He slowly calmed himself. Then he told the man he had been interrogating to get lost. Those men quickly ran away, even though their hands were still tied. Brian turned to Dan and asked if he was satisfied now. He blamed Dan for lowering their chances of finding the beast tamers involved. Dan could not believe what he was hearing. But Brian insisted those men had the antidote. He shouted at Dan that while he was busy acting like a pathetic hypocrite, the young lady was dying. Ariel remained in the same spot while they argued. She used her magic and focused on something, until suddenly she sensed it. She calmly announced that she had found them. Someone nearby had just used magic. So they hurried through the forest. But Ariel was already looking pale, and she was breathing heavily. Dan noticed her, and quickly realized she truly had 0 stamina. She had reached her limit, so she told them to go on ahead. Dan asked if it was really that bad. Brian decided to continue ahead, without them. Dan could not believe he was actually leaving. Brian replied that he did not have a single second to waste. Dan was speechless. He offered to carry Ariel on his back, but when he turned around, she was gone. Dan's eyes widened as his face froze in disbelief, like he had just witnessed the most ridiculous thing imaginable. Meanwhile, Hugo was cleaning his sword. He remembered what happened 5 years ago. Clearly, he never expected that the little brat from the Chatillon family he failed to kill back then would be hiding in a place like this. The thought made him grin. He felt incredibly lucky. Ariel wandered around. She sighed. After realizing she was lost, her terrible sense of direction had struck again. She knew she had to regroup with Dan quickly. She heard some rustling in the bushes. Curious, she moved closer to see what it was. Meanwhile, the clouds turned gray. Brian pushed through the shrubs. Then he froze. The man in front of him was someone he knew all too well. It was Hugo. This time, Hugo had a long scratch across his right eye, and the pupil on that side looked strangely pale. Hugo tilted his head and asked Brian if he knew him. He clearly didn't expect anyone to come looking for him here. Brian's hands were already shaking with anger. Hugo slowly stood up and said it didn't matter. Brian looked around. Bodies were scattered everywhere. The place was a complete bloodbath. He asked Hugo if he had done all of this, if he was the one who made the beast tamers ambush them and slaughter everyone here. Hugo glared at him and asked if that really mattered, when Brian already looked like he was itching to kill him. Brian didn't expect that answer, but Hugo didn't care, because honestly, he was already in the mood to kill someone himself. Meanwhile, Dan was frantically looking for Ariel. He kept calling out to her. He couldn't believe where she had gone in that split second. Apparently, she had a surprisingly clumsy side. He was already worried enough that Brian had gone off on his own, especially if he ended up fighting those beast tamers by himself. Dan could only scowl. This whole mess was turning into one massive headache. At that moment, Brian charged straight at Hugo. Hugo casually sidestepped to avoid the dagger. Brian swung with his other arm to strike him, but Hugo ducked under the attack and slashed Brian. Blood spilled from the wound. Then Hugo suddenly remembered him. The servant who had been with the Chatillon brat. His memory was quite sharp. He brought up that she had been poisoned, and he knew Brian had come for the antidote. Hugo pulled it out and showed it to him, just to mock him. Hugo said this was the perfect chance. Brian could save his lady's life and get his revenge at the same time. He asked why Brian was already getting so excited, but he advised him not to rush. Hugo did not want the brat to die from poison either. After surviving all that chaos, dying from a goblin's poison arrow, he said that would simply be too boring. Being mocked like that made Brian charge again. Hugo admitted that Brian's loyalty and courage were admirable, but it seemed Brian did not know his place. Brian tightened his grip on his dagger, but with a single swing of his sword, without even moving his feet, Hugo knocked one dagger out of Brian's hand. The dagger flew away and stabbed into the ground. Hugo asked if Brian really believed he could fight him with a toy like that. Brian's hand trembled. Blood dripped from it. Only then did he realize something. He had gotten so angry that he forgot for a moment just how strong this man truly was. Hugo Fagati. A former lieutenant of Ares from the Empire's strongest knight order, the Zodiacs. He carried the strange nickname, the Maniac Duelist. He earned that name because of his fanatical obsession with duels. His obsession was terrifying. Even when victory on the battlefield was already guaranteed, he would insist on a life-or-death one-on-one duel with the enemy commander to decide the outcome. And the fact that he was still alive today meant he had never lost a single duel. Brian felt completely overwhelmed. Hugo asked him what was wrong. Where had all that earlier momentum gone? Then, to motivate him, Hugo started telling a story. He explained that his left eye was injured by Reynold de Chatillon when Reynold stepped forward to protect Brian that day. Reynold had extraordinary skill, a swordsman truly worthy of the title of the Central Kingdom's greatest knightly house. Hugo said it had been a magnificent duel. He told Brian that he should have seen the look in Reynold's eyes as the light slowly faded from them when Hugo's sword pierced his heart. He said it was a shame that he was the only one who got to witness it. Then he explained his plan. After killing Brian there, he would head straight to the village and tell the young lady exactly what happened that day, in vivid detail. And after giving her the antidote, he would request a duel. He imagined the tiny lady charging at him in a fit of rage. He said he would carefully carve her up, like sculpting a piece of art. Very slowly. Very painfully. He laughed and said it sounded incredibly fun. Brian simply said no. He told Hugo that none of that would happen because Hugo would die right there. At that moment, Brian was filled with rage. Brian charged at him. He moved incredibly fast. But Hugo simply stood there calmly. Brian swung his dagger. Hugo looked bored as he dodged the attack. Then he casually moved his arm and slashed Brian across the torso, sending blood spraying into the air. Brian glanced down at the wound, but he pivoted his foot and tried to punch Hugo. Hugo swung his sword again and cut into Brian's leg. Blood kept pouring out. Brian looked down at the injury. Then he stepped back. He was getting annoyed. He asked Hugo what he was doing. Hugo repeated the question, then answered like it was obvious. He said he was just making sure his plaything didn't break too soon. That only made Brian angrier, and he called Hugo a sick bastard. Hugo told him to relax because he was already starting to lose interest anyway. He lifted one foot, then swung his sword. Brian was caught off guard. The slash struck across his chest. He coughed up blood. He couldn't understand how the attack reached him from that far away. Meanwhile, a rabbit appeared, right in front of Ariel. But what caught her attention were the large paw prints on the ground. She wondered what kind of monster could have made tracks that big. And the trail was heading straight toward Shiltrock. She wondered if it might be another one of the beast tamer's pets. Still, she figured it should be fine since the area was guarded by soldiers and hunters. She hurried off to find Dan, but something about it felt wrong, so she decided to deal with the monster first and call for backup afterward. She had already lost anyway, so chasing after him would only be a hassle. At that moment, Brian was bleeding heavily. Hugo acknowledged his sheer willpower, although it looked more like suicidal recklessness than actual bravery. Since torturing him had already lost its appeal, Hugo decided to end it quickly and painlessly. Brian realized he had been careless. He had charged in without a plan, fully aware of the massive gap between their strength. Blinded by anger, he had acted completely out of character. The truth was, he had known it from the beginning. He never stood a chance against this freak, and that pissed him off. Even more than the enemy standing in front of him, he hated his own pathetic, powerless self. Hugo calmly said his farewell. But before Hugo could move his arm, something struck him. It was a pebble. Hugo's face snapped to the side. Brian looked toward where it came from. Dan had thrown it. Hugo was shocked. Blood trickled down his forehead, and his expression twisted with fury. He demanded to know who Dan was. Dan replied that he should be the one asking that. He asked Hugo who he was and why he was trying to kill Brian. Brian shouted at Dan to get out of there and run. That only made Hugo kick him. Brian crashed to the ground head first. Dan grew worried when he saw Brian like that. Hugo wiped the blood from his forehead. He was furious that Dan had dared interrupt their so-called sacred duel. Dan asked him what kind of insane nonsense he was talking about. But before he could say more, Hugo suddenly moved. He rushed in and slashed at Dan's neck. Fortunately, Dan bent backward at the very last second and barely avoided it. Hugo looked surprised that he had actually dodged. Dan was annoyed that the guy had attacked him out of nowhere, so he swung his bat in return. Hugo was startled. He quickly stepped back. He wondered if that was magic, but he knew it wasn't. He couldn't believe that kind of destructive power came from pure physical strength alone. It was enough to make his hands tremble. After seeing Hugo go straight for his head from the very start, Dan knew a peaceful conversation was no longer an option. Hugo noticed Dan's bizarre weapon and absurd strength. He commented that Brian had picked up a very interesting friend. And that was perfect, because he had just started getting bored. With a sinister grin, Hugo declared that he wanted to see exactly what Dan was made of. Alright, that's it for today's story. If you want the weekly chapter updates for this series, those will now be uploaded on my second channel, Manhwa Updater. So if you don't want to miss what happens next, make sure to check it out and join the update gang. Thanks for watching, stay cool, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.